Wonderful. Good morning and welcome from Toronto. Thank you for the introduction and thank you for inviting me to present this webinar. I'm going to just quickly start. There was a very nice introduction, but I'm just going to quickly start and spend 1 minute talking about myself because I am my own favorite subject. Although I do a lot of speaking and training and working with folks both in companies and associations, it's not the basis of what I do. The basis of what I do is help companies like yours every day get more value out of the planning efforts that they make. So what I speak about today is from years of experience and making a lot of mistakes, to be honest, and really learning what works and what doesn't. And although the title of today's webinar sounds somewhat provocative, it's true that most strategic planning does fail. Most companies struggle to connect the dots between where they are, where they want to be, and the execution it takes to get them there. So we're going to speak today on two main issues, really, is why it fails and what we can do about it from a content and process perspective. I'm not a big cartoon guy, but this one was absolutely perfect. A Dilbert cartoon for what we're talking about today. He says, I'm thinking of getting into the strategic planning game. If I understand the job description, you basically hallucinate about the future and then something different happens. And Dilbert says, you also have to pretend it's useful. Really, that sounds hard. So I'm going to speak today about exactly that. And the part about it being hard is one of the reasons why it fails. So we're going to speak about why planning fails and what we can do about it from a content and process perspective to be more successful. I once had a colleague ask me on a long drive, he said, is it the plan or the execution? I think I surprised him and I surprised myself with the answer. For many years, I believed that real success is about effective execution. But over the last 16 years, working with companies every day, I've discovered that most companies are actually quite good at execution. In fact, execution is really what companies do every day. Ultimately, we have a large gap between our stated plan and the results against those plans because the plans themselves are flawed. The reasons are multifaceted and somewhat different for every organization, but at the end of the day, our plans lack seriousness, intent, creativity, credibility, measurability, and clarity. Over the years, we've lost our way in two core areas, content and process. Due mostly to human nature, we've placed most of the blame on process and made our planning processes bigger, more complex, and more cumbersome. The size and complexity of our process temporarily lulled us into the belief that we're making strategy when we're really just filling in templates. In so many organizations, our strategy-making efforts have been reduced to busy work. We need a clear and repeatable process to guide our efforts, and we do need to stick to the process, but it needs to be simple. If you spend more time talking about your planning process than the plan itself, then you're doing something wrong. So what are the main reasons why planning fails? First of all, some companies don't have a clear process or they have a sloppy process. And the sloppy process part we're going to talk about in a minute. There are parts of the process that we don't like to do, and so we focus on the parts we do like to do. That's also part of human nature. So even those companies who have a process, and we're going to talk about a simple process today, or at least a simple model for a process, quite often skip steps because the steps are hard or because the steps put pressure on us from an accountability perspective. Most organizations that I work with, particularly bigger organizations, there's too much process and too much emphasis on process. The content part of this is that there are, from the most senior level in companies, and I'm talking about the board through the management team, there's a fear of making plans that are both measurable and wiggle-proof. And by wiggle-proof, I mean something where we essentially bind ourselves for the future, where we paint ourselves into a corner, to use an English expression, in such a way that we have to perform. So there's an inherent fear of that, because if we make the plans clear enough and measurable enough, then the accountabilities become very clear, and it's very difficult for people to then say, why didn't we achieve this? Because specific accountabilities weren't met. The other big thing that we're going to talk about throughout this webinar today is the lack of understanding of just how serious strategy making actually is. I understand that the concept of intent seems like a vague concept, but let me explain. If you intend to have an interesting exercise and make some vague proclamations about the future in your planning process, you will see minimal results. With the wrong strategic intent, you'll be having the same strategy conversation over and over again and again. With the right strategic intent, you can be successful with almost any process. So it really does start with intent. One of the things that we try to help our organizations that we deal with understand is that when we come in to help, and this works the same in your organization as you help your organization through its strategy making and planning process, this is not an exercise. We have a tendency to think that this feels like an exercise because we take everybody out of their daily work. We take our board away or our management team away or our divisional team away, and we take them to a hotel meeting room or a nice off-site place to do a strategy retreat. We bring in a facilitator like me, and it feels like an exercise because it's different. The truth is that we have to convince ourselves that we're actually making strategy. So whenever you go into a strategy making exercise, think about the true intent of the efforts that you plan to make, because it is a lot of effort and it's a lot of work. Do you truly intend to make strategy that's going to guide and constrain the future actions and investments of the company? And do you intend to see actual progress within a year and dramatic progress within 3 years as a result of your strategy? So often we go into organizations, and from the very first strategy session, we get the impression that people are there to make strategy and make some words and then go back to business as usual. If that's the intent, we're never going to be successful. The single most important way to ensure progress is to openly discuss and agree to the seriousness of your planning process, the expected outcomes, and hardcore objectives that you expect to achieve. Your CEO, board chair, planning facilitator should sit down and discuss and agree to a number of important questions well in advance of commencing your process. This also works at the division level and the team level. So this isn't just for overall companies. This works at every level in the organization. So there are a number of key questions that we need to be able to answer before we start our process. Number one, what specifically is going to be different or better as a result of the process? What do we actually hope to achieve in the first session, the second session? So what do we actually hope to achieve? And so if the answer is, well, we're going to have a documented plan, that's really missing the point. We're not there to create words. We're there to actually make a plan and make a strategy that we all agree to, or we have strong agreement to at least, that's going to change the company, that's going to improve the company, that's going to take us to a new and better place. So specifically, what is it we're trying to achieve? The other question we want to ask is, will our team, in our process, create a strategy that actually binds us now and in the future? This, particularly for boards, and I work with boards of all kinds, is the most difficult to wrap your head around. It's very uncomfortable to make strategy that's going to cause future boards to do something differently, that's going to bind future boards by our decisions. But if we're making a strategy that really only gets us through the next year or two and isn't taking the company to a new place, then we're making hollow strategy, and we're not going to be nearly as successful with our strategy making and execution process as we hope to. So these are all precursors to having a process and to having strategic planning that doesn't fail. The other questions we need to ask is, will most of our spending in the coming years be largely dictated by the decisions we make in this process? That's a scary question for people to answer, but the answer has to be yes. if we're not making decisions that are going to essentially guide where we spend our money, the structure of our company, our resourcing, our hiring, then we're probably not going far enough in our strategy process. And we've got a hollow exercise that's about coming up with some nice words, but not actually taking the company to a new, better, and more successful place. The other critical thing, and you've all heard the comment probably that strategy is it's as much about what you're not going to do or what you're going to stop doing as what you're going to do. And this is also something that all management, all boards have a very hard time wrapping their head around. Will the decisions in our process cause us to stop, de-resource, or back burner some of the projects we're working on today? We don't want our strategy to be a 180-degree change where we have to stop everything. If that's what happens, you've got the wrong strategy. I mean, you know your company and you've already got momentum. But if we create a strategy where we say we're going to go after a new market, we're going to go after a new customer base, we're going to create some new products, whatever your company does, and we still keep doing everything else, and we don't have a strong intention to be willing to stop doing things as a result of our strategy, then we don't have strong intent to be successful. With clear agreement to intent, to make, measure, and stick to great content, the rest of our focus can be placed on process. But I have an assertion that I make with all the companies that I work with, and it sometimes surprises them. And that's that if the act of planning doesn't significantly improve our results, then not planning, then we shouldn't be doing planning. So there's two critical concepts here. On one hand, the act of making strategy, the act of having a plan, needs to take our company to a place that we would not have achieved without the plan. So on one hand, on the cost-benefit equation, we need a much bigger benefit as a result of planning. If you go into planning and you don't believe that the very act of planning is going to take your company to a new place, then you literally shouldn't do it. You should just stick to business as usual because you'll be more successful. So that's a critical concept, something very difficult to wrap your head around, but the reason we do planning is to get growth, to get improvement, to get competitive improvement, whatever it is that we're trying to do with our company. The other side of the cost-benefit equation is that the process has to be small. We can't put a lot of effort into our planning process and make it all about the process because we're not getting a good cost-benefit. So when you think about your own process, on one hand, it has to drive better results, and you have to believe in your heart that the process itself helped to drive those results and you wouldn't have achieved them anyway. And on the other hand, we need a process that's simple, understandable, straightforward, and relatively quick to work through. So to do that, on the content side, we've really talked about the piece about having strategic intent and planning for the right reasons, which I'm going to bring up again a little bit later. On the other hand, we need a process that's clear, understandable, and simple. And so I want to talk about a simple model called the integrated planning model. So, and why we actually need a conceptual model for strategy and planning. When I think about all what I've seen work and not work over the years with my clients, business planning from a process perspective usually fails because they have a process, but it's applied sporadically. And so I talked about this earlier, and I'll talk about this in more detail as I go through. There are parts of the process that we don't like, and there's no surprise that the parts of the process we don't like are related back to the strategic intent questions that I brought up before. The parts of the process that make our strategy much more clear and the accountability is much more clear are the parts we don't like. The parts of the process that actually connect the dots between that grand vision of the company and the actions and projects that we're working on every day are the parts that people don't like. So planning processes quite often fail because they're applied sporadically for that reason. The other thing is there's sometimes confusion regarding terminology and process steps. Quite often people call me and they say, come in and help us with our strat planning, but that's not actually what they need. They're actually doing okay with their strategy, the strategy part of their planning, but they're terrible with their operational planning as a result. So there's confusion around the terminology, and because of that confusion, people love to talk about process so they can avoid actually talking about strategy. So the result is business plans that are sporadic and they don't have continuity, and with these plans, because they're sporadic and they don't have good continuity, they don't stand a good chance of being successfully executed. So back to that conversation I had with my peer in the car several years ago, it really is about the quality of the plan more than the execution itself. If we can provide ourselves with a high quality plan, we stand a much better chance of successful execution. And the high quality plan has all the ingredients of intent, measurability, credibility, creativity, etc., the things that I mentioned before. So the integrated planning model is a simple concept to essentially force us through the steps and help us ensure that those steps are connected. It really just provides us a framework to remove some of the confusion and help people understand how the various parts of our process fit together, and more importantly, where we're at in our process, whose job it is at each step of the process, what we're trying to achieve at each step of the process, without creating huge documents and filling in huge templates. We really want to put a focus on accountability and the integrated nature from top to bottom of this planning model. If we follow a model, and it doesn't have to be my model, but if you follow a model diligently in your company, you'll stand a much better chance of having plans that are going to be executed successfully, and will overcome this gap between our planning and our execution. I'm not going to read out the 6 components because we're going to look at them in detail. I put the ladders here because this really is meant to be a stepwise approach where each step is connected to the next. So, and finally, here it is. This is a simple conceptual model that helps us ensure that we effectively connect our strategic, operational, and tactical planning. It helps ensure that the actions we're taking and the projects we're executing are actually aligned to the strategy of our company, our division, or our team. Of course, it's critical that each step we can actually measure the efficacy of our plans and execution. That's where that metrics and measures box comes in down the side. Following the model won't guarantee a perfect line of sight between the projects we're working on every day and the grand strategy of the company, but disciplined use of the model at least provides a crooked line of sight, if nothing else, so that we don't feel like our efforts are completely unaligned with the person at the next office over. So we'll go through some of the particulars, but just to kind of give a summary overview of the model, it's not meant to be the be-all and end-all, and it's not meant to be a silver bullet that's going to magically connect our strategy to the projects and actions we're working on every day. It's just meant to force us through some steps and make sure that we don't skip those steps, and make sure that the right people are working at the right level throughout the model. And so that brings me to the 5 key principles of this model. So as we move from top to bottom of the integrated planning model, number 1, the planning horizon measured in time decreases. So as you move from strategic planning through operational planning, through project and action planning, the planning horizon gets shorter. So as an example, mission and values really are almost indeterminate in length. These are things, your mission is your very reason for being. These can go on for 20 years more. A vision quite often is 5 years plus. Practical vision, which we'll talk about in detail today, is 3 years. Strategic imperatives usually run between 12 and 18 months. Operational planning is 4 quarters, hopefully 4 rolling quarters. And then we only ever look out our planning horizon about 90 days for project and action planning. So as we move from top to bottom, the time, the planning horizon measured in time decreases. The other thing that happens as we move from top to bottom of our model is the level of detail increases. So it's perfectly acceptable that we don't put a lot of detailed description into our very high level strategy. That's perfectly acceptable as long as we are specific and measurable. We don't need a lot of detail. At the bottom of our model, though, however, we need an incredible amount of detail when it comes to the detailed plans that we're using to execute in this case, our operational plan. So as we move from top to bottom, the level of detail increases. The other thing that happens as we move from top to bottom is the specificity of the associated targets and metrics increases. So I'll just spend a minute talking about this because it's a new concept for some people, but it'll make perfect sense to you. At the very top of our model, you can see there I've put some examples in that we have very strategic metrics and very strategic targets. So depending on your company, this could be your ROE, this could be your EPS, and this could be very big measures. For example, if our practical vision was to be in a new market in 3 years, well, which market, how much in that market, what kind of market share are we capturing, et cetera. So these very big, very broad, and fairly unspecific metrics. At the bottom of our model, we need to measure in a very specific capacity because we need metrics that are aligned to the words. So I'll give you an example. A couple of years ago, I had a client in public health, and they were trying to, part of what they were trying to do in their 3-year vision, their 3-year practical vision, was actually improve the diabetes rate in a particular community. So this is quite a broad thing, and their strategy was fantastic, and their strategy was to really change the health of the public in the area of diabetes. They were measuring that by the number of pamphlets that they handed out. So you can see that there's a strong mismatch between the specificity, the number of pamphlets they handed out was very, very specific, and the actual strategy that they were trying to achieve. So we need broad, high-level, big metrics at the top of our model and very specific metrics at the bottom of our model, and we don't want to mix those two. The other thing that happens is the number of people involved with planning as we move from top to bottom increases, and the level of people in our staff decreases. These are the two most important principles of the model. Number one, at the top of our model, we want to be planning with our most senior people because they have the obligation to set the strategy, but we need to stop our most senior people from stepping outside their bounds and getting in, for example, to operational planning. So our basic cutoff line with boards and senior management is tell us the what of the strategic. So tell us where we need to be in 5 years, 3 years. Tell us the what of our strategic imperatives. So what are the 5 main priorities we need to achieve in the next 3 years? But don't tell us how to achieve it. We've got this amazing management to go and actually figure out the underlying operational plans. And we've got these incredible project managers to help come up with the project plans that are actually going to achieve our operational plans that are actually going to help us achieve our strategic imperatives. So it's incredibly important that we don't plan with a cast of thousands at the top. We involve people where they need to be involved throughout our planning process. I wish I had a whole webinar or a whole training session just to talk about that, because that's quite often where we go wrong, bringing the wrong people in at the wrong place. One of the critical points I want to make here is common sense, but it's usually overlooked by my clients. To use the integrated planning model effectively, or do effective planning, any effective planning for that matter, you must first determine what the plan will be used for. And this goes back to the question of intent that I talked about earlier. Although this might seem obvious, the best business plans are those that were created to help managers grow, improve, and operate their operations effectively. When clients tell me they need a plan because their board wants a plan document, that's exactly what they're going to get, a document gathering dust. If you create a plan to satisfy someone else's requirements or just because you do it every year, keep your expectations low. These plans are quickly forgotten and the organization basically just goes back to business as usual for another year. If you set out to create a plan that will create alignment between board and management and provide guidance for your decisions, you'll create robust executable plans. You have a critical role in carefully laying the groundwork for creating a successful business plan. Talk to your boss and your team before you get started about why you're planning and what you're going to do with the outcome. This may seem like a small point, but it's critical to a successful and rewarding planning. I'm going to give you a very small example and see if I can make this point clear. Quite a few years ago, in fact, it was my very first big engagement. I was engaged by a large insurance company, and they warned me that 2 other consultants had attempted the project that they were asking me to do, but with poor results. In essence, the organization had been spinning their wheels on this particular problem for years, and no one could seem to help. The client made the reports that the other consultants came up with available to me. They were good. They were comprehensive. They'd done comprehensive interviews, employee surveys. The consultants had even made some good high-level recommendations about how to fix the problem. So my client had 2 very nice and very expensive binders with all this information. Well, then what happened? I asked my client. Well, the client said that was the end of it. Nothing ever got done about it. That's why we called you. I looked at them and I took one more shot. What did you tell the other consultants when they asked you why you wanted to do this project? Their answer was, because our board told us we needed a plan on this particular subject. It seems to me the organization got exactly what they asked the other consultants to do. Just for fun, I asked a few more questions. Did you ever tell the other consultant you wanted to correct the problem? No. Did you ever tell the other consultant that you wanted to implement a solution? No. The bad news is the client wasted a lot of time and money. The good news is I got the business and a firm commitment to create a plan that would be used to change the situation for the better. Just so we're clear, this was not an issue of miscommunication between the organization and the consultants. The organization really only wanted a plan to satisfy their board. They didn't want a plan to drive action and cause change. The only reason I was successful was that the organization wanted a plan from me to drive action and cause change because they were now ready for it, because the pain of the problem now outweighed their fear of change. So let's have a quick look at each main component of the integrated planning model. In my experience with organizations of all sizes, strategic planning or strategy is often confused to be identical with business planning in general. As you become familiar with the integrated planning model, you'll learn that strategy is just one part of successful business planning. Here, along with the concept of practical vision, are the strategy concepts you'll find in the strategic planning diamond. So just going to quickly walk through the main concepts, and then we'll go into much more detail in strategic imperatives and practical vision. So a vision, and most of us know this already, is really just where an organization wants to be and what that will look like at some specific point in time in the future. So, you know, when I talk to people about vision, I really say, think about as if we were already there, and if we could jump ahead 3 years or 5 years, and it's much easier with 3, which we'll talk about. If we could jump ahead 3 years, what do you want to see? What do you want the company to actually look like? We don't talk about how we got there. We don't talk about the obstacles we overcame. We just talk about what there looks like. So if we could describe the future state of our company, what does that actually look like? That's essentially the vision. It gets confused with so many other things, but it is our goalpost that we're shooting for. Most companies start with lousy, unspecific, unmeasurable marketing pieces, really, and call them visions. If that's where we start, the whole rest of our process is doomed to failure. A mission is really why a company's in business in the first place. This is their reason for being. This is really why are we here and who do we serve? Nothing else. A mission can be, you know, really as short as a couple sentences, well-worded sentences, but we have to be very clear about mission. Values is really what an organization believes are the best ways of doing business, which are critical to our long-term performance. So a lot of organizations confuse that the values are the right way of doing business. Well, we all know the right way of doing business is to treat employees with respect, as an example, or treat the environment with respect, or whatever our values in our organization are. We have to believe those are actually the best ways of doing business. Otherwise, we're paying lip service to our values. Our strategy overall is really just describes how the company is going to achieve its vision within the confines of its mission while remaining steadfast to its values. So just think about that. Strategy overall really is just what are we going to do at a high level to get to that place we've described within the confines of the kind of company we are, so without breaking or going outside of our mission, while remaining aligned and steadfast to the values that we say are the best ways of doing business. And finally, value proposition is really what an organization does that's going to cause their clients, their customers, to realize tangible benefits through the use of their product or service or working with their company in general. Again, I could probably spend a half a day going through just that part of the integrated planning model, but just to give you a flavor, that's at the top of the model. Before we move off the top diamond, though, I want to quickly introduce you to the concept of the practical vision. As I said before, most organizations start with visions that are flawed. We want to move to, I try with almost all my clients to move to a more practical, measurable vision. And so practical vision really should be the statement that comes out of it. First, it has to be practical, but back to my assertion before, it has to be a stretch to achieve. It has to take us to a new place, but people still need to look at it and say, this is possible. This is something that we can actually do. We're not writing down this amazing vision and everybody leaves the room and says under their breath, yeah, that's nice, but we'll never get there. A practical vision is something that we can say, look at each other and say, this is going to be tough as heck, but this is really going to take us to a new place. So practical vision statements have to be specific, but at the same time, when they're specific and measurable, they still need to compel and inspire people to do something differently. So it's really a description of what the organization is going to look like in the future. Although I say it's specific and measurable and achievable, it still has to be described at a macro level. This is not a tactical document in any way. And it's not a communication piece. So if you set out to achieve something, you set out to write something that you're going to put on your website, you've done the wrong thing. You want to set out to write something that everybody can stand behind and say, this is what we're shooting for. This is going to guide the rest of our strategy and planning efforts. And if we can take something nice out of that and put it on our website, great. The other thing that's critical about the practical vision is it should be stated 3 years in the future. I found over the years that once you get into 4 or 5 years, it's too easy to walk out of the room at the end of, for example, the vision session and say, that was really fun, and then forget about it. If it's less than 3 years, I think it puts too much pressure on people, and our vision really has to be too small to be achievable. 3 years, I found, is just about right, where we can make people feel quite uncomfortable that it's going to be very difficult to achieve, but we want to leave the room essentially at the end of creating our practical vision and say, okay, if we're serious about being at that place in 3 years, we need to start something different on Monday. And that's really what we're trying to achieve with that 3-year time frame. I talked a little bit about this, but doing strategy, I've had so many people just talk about doing strategy or strategy work on its own is really a hollow exercise. It's just one part of our process. But this is exactly what many consultants and executives like to do because it makes everybody feel good. To really help your organization create plans that will be successfully executed, you'll need to work through the entire integrated planning model. Strategy is fun. It's the rest of it that's hard work. So let's talk about strategic imperatives. As suggested by the diagram, strategic imperatives are really the glue that connects strategic and operational planning. Strategic imperatives are the key items from the strategic plan that provide crucial information to form the operational plan. This key ingredient is missing in almost every planning process and in almost every plan that I've seen with my clients when we first start working with them. So strategic imperatives really are the single most important aspect of this overall model. They're usually developed by an organization's either board or most senior executive team, and they're really just a series of strategic statements that describe the organization's focus over a relatively short period of time, usually 12 to 18 months. These statements articulate large pieces of strategically consequential work. They have to be big, but they have to be measurable and achievable, and they have to have a start and finish. Those are critical points. And so when we take our strategic imperatives together, it really helps to describe a large part of the organization's strategy for the next 12 to 18 months. Most companies employ a concept of strategic statements or strategic priorities or strategic directions. There are a couple key differences with strategic imperatives. Number one, they actually have to be imperative, meaning if we don't accomplish these 5 or 6 things in the next 12 months, we know we will not achieve our practical vision in 3 years. So we should never articulate a strategic imperative if we know that it's not actually critical, important, and urgent. So if we know it's not actually imperative to achieving our vision, then it's just directional in nature and we shouldn't achieve it, or pardon me, we shouldn't articulate it. More importantly, strategic imperatives have clear objectives and each has a start and finish date. This is really a part of us projectizing our strategy, and this is a critical concept and a real turning point for my clients. Most clients have this open-ended strategic directions. When we say, no, we need 4 things or 5 things that we're going to start and finish. Each is going to have objectives. Each is going to be measurable. It really takes us to a new place. In all the planning processes I've seen, operational planning is most often the missing ingredient. This is one of the parts that's hard and hard to wrap our head around. So if your organization has a sound strategy and disciplined project management, so you're doing well at the top and you're doing well at the bottom, but it seems like you can never execute your plan, it's usually a lack of focus in this operational planning part. Your operational plan really lays out how the strategic imperatives will be accomplished. So let's say that our board or our senior executive team came up with the 5 things that we must accomplish in the next 12 months. And then if I was the facilitator, I'd say, okay, stop there. Let's now go work with 5 teams of management that actually know what they're talking about how to achieve these things. So once we build the how around each strategic imperative, that essentially forms the basis of our operational plan. So if we've got 5 strategic imperatives for the next 12 months, and we define the objectives, deliverables, action plan, timeline, accountabilities for each of those, that essentially forms the basis of our operational plan. But our operational plan really describes and lays out how we're going to achieve our strategic imperatives. But in turn, the operational plan then provides very clear direction to what the projects and actions will be necessary to execute. So it's got this critical part in our process where without it, we have a great strategy or a good strategy, and we've got a great project management execution, but we don't have that connecting tissue. So at some point, all this planning is really just hypothetical until we actually execute something, until we actually take action. Project, tactical, and action planning is the execution end of our model. So it's also, you can call it whatever you want, but really this is where, in my terminology, the rubber hits the road. If we're not actually executing projects aligned to our operational plan that's aligned to our strategic imperative, then all we've done is create a really nice plan. Tactical planning has been quite successful in a lot of companies because companies have gotten much better at project management over the years. Project management and actually managing individual projects. Unfortunately, project management in most companies is still quite disjointed from the rest of the planning process. So we built these good capabilities in project management. We built project management offices in a number of companies, but we haven't taken the steps to connect those projects, mostly through strategic project portfolio management, to connect those projects back to our strategy. So this action planning connects to our operational planning really through our portfolio of projects and making sure that the vast majority of the projects that we're executing, we're resourcing, we're working on every day are aligned to our operational plan and ultimately to our strategic imperatives. That probably should be a topic for a whole other webinar, but this project portfolio management is where we actually make the connection from our project and tactical planning back to our operational planning. Finally, our entire concept of comprehensive, measurable, and practical planning process that aligns across the organization isn't going to be successful if we don't have crystal clear metrics and targets that integrate the words and the numbers of our plan. We're looking for our metrics to be horizontally aligned with our plans and vertically with themselves. So what does that mean? It really means that the metrics and measures at the most strategic level of our plan For example, we need metrics and measures that clearly define how we're going to measure the success of our practical vision. We need metrics and measures that clearly define how we're going to measure the success of our strategic imperatives. And all the way down, we need metrics and measures that clearly define how we're going to execute on our specific projects, actions, and underlying tactics. On the flip side, KPIs, balanced scorecards, whatever you've got in your organization, this is really what most organizations, it's the only thing that they do and they consider this planning. The metrics and measures part of our plan, the performance indicators part of our plan, really just provides credibility and an order of magnitude to the words, and it acts as a yardstick really to measure our performance against our plans. So in your own company, when you think about your own company, you need to focus both on content and process. You need a simple framework for your process, whether that's the integrated planning model or something else, to focus your efforts. And we need, most importantly, we need a strong champion at the most senior level of the organization that understands this, preferably the CEO or somebody very close to the CEO. If you were going to only do one thing, I would say focus on the intent piece. Focus on what do we actually hope to get out of this, and let's pick away at the process bit by bit. All right, so I know that was a lot of stuff packed into a 40-minute webinar. I'd like to open it up for questions now, and I'll do my best, but as you can see, there's probably a whole day's worth of material here, but I'd like to at least give you the highlights.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Peter Wright, for a very, very intriguing presentation. Folks, we are now open for question and answers. If you have any questions, you could either put it in the question box or you could equally raise your hand. There's a hand icon available on your webinar console, so if you click on it, we can give you an opportunity to speak directly to Mr. Peter Wright. Let me go straight to the question box. We have a couple of questions. The first one, our company has a mission and vision which are quite vague. How do I convince my boss that we need a new vision to be better at executing our strategy?
That's a great question, and that's one that for a number of years I struggled with myself. How do I convince clients that their vision isn't sound and it's the reason why they're not executing their strategy? And I'll be honest, and this might sound a little bit funny, but at one point I realized the best approach to this, and if you're trying to do this in your own organization, is to say, hey, we're not going to change the mission and vision. So we have a good mission. We all understand why we're here. We have a sound vision. It gives us a good long-term goalpost that we're shooting for. What we want to do is we want to start one level down. So we're going to leave the original mission and vision alone. We're going to start one level down, and underneath our vision, we're going to create this much more practical, slightly shorter term, much more measurable, practical vision. So that's really the way I've gotten around this over the years is rather than trying to attack and change everything, let's go in and say, everything's fine, but let's start one level down so that we can be more successful with something like this integrated planning model. So the other thing I found is that if you start there, it's a much easier entry point. It's a much easier conversation to have. And then once you see success and once you have these very strong discussions about both your practical vision and everything else in your strategy, then people maybe a year or two later will be open to looking at the overall vision and mission of the organization. Hope that answers your question.
Well, thank you very much. We have another one. We have a balanced scorecard already. Can we integrate it with this approach?
Absolutely, and most companies have either a set of performance metrics or a balanced scorecard or KPIs, depending on what you call it in your organization, and the answer is yes. Not only should we integrate it with this approach, we must integrate it with this approach. So rather than try and change the whole world here, I would use the parts that you have, for example, a balanced scorecard, and connect them to the process as closely as you can. But what you're going to find is that slowly over time, as you have a clearer understanding of your practical vision, your strategic imperatives, your operational plan, you're going to want to slowly adapt the metrics to better reflect the strategy. So what we don't want to end up is with a a disconnect or a mismatch between the words of our strategy and the metrics or the numbers of our strategy, those metrics and underlying targets. We want a strong connection, as I said, horizontally between the words and the numbers at each level of our strategy. But start with your existing balanced scorecard, integrate it with your process, and then let the new words slowly over time take you to a place where it's much more integrated than it was when you started. I hope that answers your question.
Well, thank you very much. Another one we have, what is the process for actually aligning our projects to our strategy?
Yeah, and as I said, I could easily spend a whole day just talking about this, but the truth is that if you think back to the model, if we follow this incredible process, it's simple, it's straightforward, it helps people articulate the most strategic, and then our strategic imperatives, and then our operational plan. If we don't then actually force and manage the fit of our projects to our operational plan, then we really haven't done anything. We've got this nice strategy that's executable, and we've got these projects going on that aren't connected. So my rule of thumb with my clients, especially after a couple of years, is that 70 to 80% of the projects that we're working on, that we're resourcing, that we're spending money on, that people across the company are working on, 70 to 80% of the projects actually have to be strongly aligned to our strategic imperatives. And so in most organizations, how we do this is we start with all the projects we have underway. We kind of throw out the ones that are almost done, and we say, okay, just let them finish. Everything else, we say, is there strong alignment? And if not, we have to actually stop them. So there's this initial pass where we actually have to create alignment between our projects that we've got going and the strategy that we've set out for ourselves. And it's not to say we're not going to ever do them, but we're not going to do them today because they're not aligned to our strategic imperatives. That's the first thing, is that initial, readjustment essentially. Very, very difficult, very, very painful. Probably the most painful thing that I do in organizations is that initial readjustment of their projects to align it to their strategy. The second thing that we need, of course, is to make sure that we continue to create, and enforce alignment between the projects that we're approving and executing and the strategy. And so most of my organizations, after I've worked with them for a couple of years, they'll have essentially a small team of operational managers. So not the most senior people, but the next level down, the actual middle managers who actually understand the projects and really control most of the resources in the organization. These people usually meet on a quarterly basis to look at the project portfolio, continually rejig it, and continually make sure that it's aligned to the strategy, in this case, the strategic imperatives. So very strong connection. It takes quite a bit of discipline management. Most of the companies that I work with have to spend about a day a month making sure that the project portfolio is continually aligned to their strategic imperatives. But if we're serious about connecting the dots from the top of our model to the bottom of our model, it takes that amount of effort to make sure that we're successful. Hopefully that answered your question.
Well, thank you very much. Another one, can you give us an example of how to make the vision more specific and measurable, like the practical vision you described?
Yeah, and it's so easy for me to talk theoretically about this, but until we actually get into a vision of your company, it's really hard to understand what do we mean by being more specific, measurable, and practical. So overall, first of all, a vision statement is usually quite vague. Sometimes it's not a vision statement at all. It's either a mission or a strategy. But we want to do a few things. Number one, we want to make it so that everybody understands that the vision, the practical vision, is by us and for us. It's not for public consumption. It's not something that we're going to show to our customers. It's not something that we're going to put in our annual report. This is only meant to guide our decisions. So to give you a specific example of something that might be in a vision versus a practical vision, quite often I'll see a vision with a client and they'll say, we want to be the leader in this market. We want to be basically the best and everything to everybody. And we want to be a $500 million company. Or quite often, they won't even say that. They won't even come right out in their vision and say how big they want to be in 3 years. So first thing is we can put actual measurements in our vision because it's only for us and it's only to guide the next level of our planning. So we could come right out and say, hey, today we're a $400 million company, and in 3 years' time we want to be a $500 million company. We can go one step farther, and we can have a number of statements under our platform statement about the kind of company we want to be. So let's say we want to be a $500 million company. We could say that 40% of the growth, I'm making this up, but 40% of the growth between now and this new place, this $500 million place, is going to come from our core markets. So it's going to come from the markets, the customers, the processes that we're in today. We could say that, you know, X percent or $10 million or whatever, however specific we want to be, is going to come from the creation of new products. We could say that, we could even say that some percentage of our growth is going to come from a market that we're not in today, and we don't even actually know what it is yet. So we don't have to have all the answers, but we have to be specific enough to force the next step of our strategy. So we can be very specific, but again, not in any way detailed. So let's use that example where we want to be a $500 million company. We want 40% of our growth from core markets, 10% of our growth from new product innovation, 20% of our growth from acquisitions, and 20% of our growth from markets we don't even yet know what they are, but we know we need to expand. So we can be that specific, and we should be that specific, because if we're not that specific and that measurable, well, how do we know then what the priorities of the company should be, and how do we know then what actions and projects we should actually be working on to achieve either that financial growth or the new competitive differentiation that we're trying to achieve? So those are, very simple examples, but that's the kind of level of specificity that we're talking about and the kind of level of measurability we're talking about in a practical vision versus a regular vision. Hopefully that answered your question.
Thank you very much. We have one last question. The discussion about intent makes sense, but how can I possibly have the conversation with my boss on the same?
Yeah, this is a very difficult one, and it's easy for me as a consultant, or easier for me as a consultant, to go into a company and say, hey, are you guys really serious about this? So before we come and work with you, it's easy for me to say, we don't want a hollow exercise. We want to make sure that you make real change as a result of your efforts with us. It's a little easier for an external consultant to say that than for somebody to say that to their boss, particularly their board chair. Here's what I would do if I was in your position, is I would start with one session. So let's say, in our process, we're going to have a strategy session with our board where we define our practical vision as an example. I would start with just that one session, and I would ask to sit down with the boss and the person who's most accountable for the results of the strategy and say, what do we want to get out of this session? So, and if the answer is, well, we want a document, what are we willing to do with that document? Are we going to be making decisions in this session that are going to actually bind or cause us, or bind our future decisions, or cause us to resource things in a certain way? If we come up with some strategic components, let's say a strategic imperative in this session, are we willing to invest in those? Or are we just going to come up with a nice strategy and not invest in it? So I know it's a very difficult internal conversation to have, but I would focus really on that initial session, that initial conversation. So rather than making it about the whole process and we have to have great intent that we're going to change the world with this strategy, what are we going to do with just this session? What is going to be unique, better, special, different as a result of the work that we're going to do? Are we willing to cause things to happen as a result of the strategy we define in this session that will cause us to stop things? And are we actually committed to stopping some things as a result of the strategic decisions we make in this session? So basically, I take those questions that I said, that's really what we should be talking about for the whole process. And I'd take a very small and specific form of each of those questions and boil it down to just that first strategy session, or just that first discussion. It makes the conversation easier. It makes it a little safer if you're an internal person. But it still starts to move you down the path towards having this much stronger strategic intent, if that makes sense.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Peter Wright. That really brings us towards the end of the webinar. Any concluding remarks that you would like to give before we dismiss out?
Yeah, not really. Just to say, I understand that today there was a lot of stuff packed into one webinar. The concepts, I hope I got the key concepts across. If you take one thing away from today, please realize that while process is important, a lot of companies put too much emphasis on process, and it becomes all about the process, and I hope you don't do that. It really is all about the intent of what we're willing to do with our strategy. So that's about all the closing comments that I have.
Well, thank you very much once again. I really want to thank you on behalf of the Madinah Institute for Leadership and Entrepreneurship, Mile. Thank you very much, sir, for your time and for your willingness to share this valuable information with our attendees. So thank you very much, and thank you all of those who attended this webinar. We are recording it. Please stay tuned to webinar.mile.org to learn about our upcoming webinars and programs, and equally to access the archived section. With that note, I would like to end and conclude this session, so you all will be automatically dismissed out. You all have a good day, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you're calling from.